Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on boosting the value of your solutions and voice biometrics from Aculab. Normally we might wait for a few stragglers, but I'm going to go on to the housekeeping now, and those guys will just have to catch up. They're not going to miss much because it'll take a few moments to get to the actual meat of the presentation. So before we get started then, let's go over a few housekeeping items so that you know you get the best from today's event. You should see something looks like this screenshot on your own desktop. So on the left is the presentation viewer, and on the right is the control panel where you can select audio mode and ask questions. You're listening in on your computer's audio system by default. So if you'd like to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. So you can send in those questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect them and address them during the QA session at the end of the presentation. So here's the rogues gallery of presenters for today. Our guest presenter is by no means a rogue. He's Matt Smallman, a co-founder of SymNex Consulting Ltd, whom some of you may know already. Supporting Matt are myself, Ian Colville, and my colleagues Walter and Mark from Aculab. Here's the agenda we'll be presenting. The first two topics will be covered by Matt. Walter and Mark will cover the examples, and Matt and I will handle the next two items respectively. So over to you, Matt. Let's get on.
Thanks, Ian. So just before we get started, a little about me and what I do, if you haven't heard from me. First off, I'm not a salesman. I'm a practitioner. I've spent much of the last 10 years trying to give customers the authentication experiences they deserve and getting pointless processes out of the way. This all started internally leading customer service, strategy, change and transformation functions for several different financial services organizations. And now as an independent consultant, I'm out there every day working with end user organizations to make the case, accelerate delivery and maximize the impact of these type of solutions. Now, before we get started, the theory and science of this stuff isn't new. Some of the earliest patents on the use of voice for verification of identity are more than 60 years old, and some organizations have been using earlier versions of this technology for more than 20 years. But I think it's important to think about why now is the time for change and why now is the time to think about starting using voice biometrics in your products and services. So that's what I'm going to cover first. So it's somewhat of a glib statement, perhaps, to say that customer expectations and behavior have changed. Every new service, every product will say that. But I want to focus on two particular areas, convenience and security. First, convenience. Now, I've used the iPhone as an example here. And if we roll back almost 12 years, there were no apps, no Uber, no Deliveroo, no device or even contactless payments. Amazon was there, but it was still largely about books, and no one delivered your groceries to your home in Europe. And now look where we are. At the heart of many of these businesses, they're doing nothing fundamentally new. Their key disruptive feature has been user convenience. They remove friction from stuff we all have to do anyway. I can request my cab from inside the restaurant and not have to wait at the curb when it's raining. I don't have to fight my way through the suit. And as a result, customer expectations of convenience have dramatically increased. The absence of friction is the new normal, and when it does exist, customers notice it. It's no longer acceptable for an organization to depend on a PIN number issued by post 5 years ago to access services over the phone, particularly if their competitors answer the phone by name, respond to their query immediately, taking care of security in the background. In a recent survey, 85% of customers were dissatisfied with the authentication experience they received during their most recent call with a service provider, and 61% said it took too long to identify them. In parallel with that, the second expectation that is changing is of security. Again, if we think back 12 years ago, we didn't really think about our own personal security and data that much. Very little of our lives was online. Very few people even enabled the PIN lock on their first iPhone. But now we've had Touch ID and then Face ID, and their alternatives on different devices, which both increase security and remove the effort associated with it. At the same time, fraudsters and other bad actors are increasingly sophisticated and tenacious, using the same technologies to make it easier for customers to serve themselves to form more efficient and effective criminal networks. It's estimated that more than 5 billion personal records were compromised last year, and of those, 47% contain dates of birth, the common kind of knowledge-based authenticator. And as a result, more than 6.5% of the population were victims of identity fraud in 2017. It's entirely possible to buy a full UK citizen's identity for less than $25, obtain a bank account somewhere else through a mule or similar, and outsource the calling or clicking to a specialist offshore operation. No one really thinks their mother's maiden name or date of birth is secret anymore, and consumers and particularly enterprises now expect security by design in the products and services they purchase. Aside from these customer expectations of increased convenience and security, legacy knowledge-based authentication has three major challenges for all enterprises. The first, customer frustration. Significant numbers of customers are denied service on a daily basis or have very painful experiences getting it. These distract them for their reasons for calling and ultimately impact the perception of an organization's competence. Who on this call has not shared a poor security experience with friends and colleagues, poking fun at the organization responsible? It's not unusual to see 10 to 20% of callers being denied service and upwards perhaps of 30% experiencing some authentic difficulties proving that they are who they claim to be. Secondly, it's time consuming. All of this takes both customer and, more importantly, the time of frontline colleagues to handle. Not just on that call, but in other channels when we ask them to write, email, call back, or visit a physical location when all else fails. And finally, it provides very little, if any, security. At the same time as creating all this extra work for real customers and frontline staff, often our fraudsters are the most prepared, and knowledge-based authentication generally only provides trivial levels of security for the determined attacker to exploit social media or socially engineer pins and passwords from real customers. If we look through the business case then, these are very simply two major opportunities. The first, for revenue, opportunities for organizations to deepen relationships with existing customers, increase their level of advocacy, or simply complete sales that we couldn't have done because we couldn't identify the customer, or they wouldn't accept because they're so frustrated with the amount of time it took us to process them through our security processes. And secondly, cost, where we have capacity tied up in a handling a process that delivers little real value to customers or the enterprise, and additionally the cost of compensating customers for losses and or the additional controls required to make up for weaknesses in frontline security processes and investigation and redress of those breaches. So end users and enterprise want better ways to authenticate customers, and what better way than using the voice that is inherently part of requesting many services. As I said at the beginning, the science is not new. We can use the unique properties of the spoken voice to be sure that we are speaking to the genuine customer quickly and transparently as they get on with solving their problem. We'll look at a little bit more of some of the key concepts shortly, but for now, know that we can eliminate the time that would have been spent on knowledge-based questions that any reasonably competent imposter will be able to answer. We don't need the customer to worry about remembering the right answers. We significantly reduce the probability that an imposter can get through, and it's quicker, easier, and in summary, it's quicker, easier, and more secure to use a voice than the knowledge-based authentication in many cases. And we know it works. We're no longer in early adopter territory here, although there are still some opportunities for innovation and fast followers to leapfrog their competitors. Only in a handful of industries and countries is this now genuinely novel. We have numerous proof points that not only does the technology work, but the customers will adopt it and it will drive business benefits. So unlike me, you don't run the risk of being laughed out of your CIO's office as I was a few years ago for proposing such a solution. So how do biometrics work? Let's take the example of the fingerprint, which everyone has at least some familiarity with. In the case of matching fingerprints found at a crime scene with one of a few suspects, the investigator must first observe and capture it using dust, a camera, or some specific device. Then they must extract or classify the key features that differentiate fingerprints. And if you look at yours now, you'll see the positions of the loops and swirls and the number of loops and swirls there are on each finger and where they're positioned in relative to each other are those key differentiating features. And then they need to be compared with those held on record or of the suspects. Importantly, we need to have that in advance. And finally, we need to make a decision as to whether the record is a close enough match to warrant further investigation or prosecution. And the same is true for voice biometrics, but whilst the fingerprint example was one of identification, establishing who from many records this one sample belongs to, In voice biometrics, we can also use it for verification, establishing a level of confidence that the speaker is who they claim to be. And it follows a very similar process. First, through observation. Helpfully, most service interactions already involve a pretty sophisticated capture device, the modern smartphone. So there is little or no cost to deploy a special sensor. It then requires extraction and classification by a voice biometric system that establishes the key distinguishing features either from a known phrase, such as "my voice is my password" in common use in the UK, or from more free-flowing conversation as might typically happen with an agent or associate in a contact center. It then makes statistical comparison with the previously registered speaker and returns a result as a degree of confidence that must be interpreted depending on the use case as to whether it is sufficient to allow the transaction to proceed or not. And it's this probabilistic comparison that is a central and key difference between this and more deterministic approaches such as knowledge-based authentication. Now, this isn't a perfect example, but given a hypothetical range of scores from 0 to 100, with 100 being a perfect match for the speaker, genuine speakers will tend to score in the higher end, but due to perfectly normal variations in their voice and audio conditions from day to day, their range of scores will vary. Similarly, the vast majority of imposters sound nothing like the real speaker and will tend to score very poorly, but at the margins, there are potential for these distributions to overlap, such that if we want to eliminate the chance of any imposter ever being allowed in, we would need to set this threshold such that a significant number of real speakers were rejected, and vice versa. The key advantage of voice biometric systems is that we can truly quantify these probabilities with a very high degree of accuracy. And the result of this trade-off, however, is the creation of a couple of error states, false rejects and false accepts, which must be handled gracefully. When someone is rejected, you don't really know whether they're imposter or genuine speaker. The vast majority will be genuine, but unable to authenticate themselves on that particular day. Now, whilst the increasing accuracy of systems and technology and products by many vendors reduces these error rates, don't let anyone tell you that they will ever be zero. The real world simply doesn't work like that. So that's enough of the theory. I'd like to hand over now to Walter, who's going to talk to you through some real life case studies.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Walter Emanuel, and I will present you a couple of VoiSentry applications. The first one is related to workforce management as a client that has been done in Italy by an Italian company called ITEL. These guys are a supplier of IT solutions to HR department, contact centers, PA organizations, healthcare, and so on. They focus primarily on simplifying working processes and enhancing company performances by offering a suite of software applications that now include also VoiSentry. The challenge was a client of theirs happened to be, well, the APO stands for Agency for Governing the Po River. Basically, it's an environmental services with mobile workers, hundreds of them, 300 plus, that had issues relative to the personnel absenteeism and call it increasing efficiency. They currently use a bad system that is not really delivering what they are expecting, and they've been in search of new technology since a while until they came across to ITEL that offered them a solution based on voice biometric as a EID, or even better, call it voice ID in this case. VoiSentry is completely integrated in the ITEL solution that is offering automatic management such as attendance, shift working, absence capabilities. It's a totally scalable and expandable system, and voice biometric replaced the old, well-known badge technology. Inevitably, there are a number of benefits in using such technology, as Matt mentioned earlier on. The first one is the usability and the simplicity of the ITEL solutions that is made of simple, intuitive voice authentication made by number and words. that are easy to enroll and authenticate by the end user. Of course, the system for whoever operates in Europe has to be GDPR compliant. It eliminates happily old badges, and inevitably, as Matt also mentioned, there is money on the plate. So this system increases sensibly the ROI and the profit of the company with a fully expensible and reliable solution. We have then another totally different application that I want to share with you that is related to healthcare. And this company happened to be a very large American healthcare IT provider that is providing solution to practice and patient for practice management and patient engagement, with huge number of doctors using that in the UK, in the US, as you can see, 130,000 plus, but also overseas with, well, probably close to 1 million of users globally. Aculab Cloud is already used in their own, Aculab Cloud, by the way, is another technology that we provide, is already used by this company to handle messaging services, basically voice and SMS reminders, appointment reminders. The challenge that this organization has been facing is easier access to the electronic health records, also called EHR, by integrating messaging services that allow management of patient appointment and information, confirming invitation and request, reducing the not attended occurrences, basically misappointment, and getting the right information to the right patient, all with the HIPAA compliance. For anyone that is not American, it means probably not much, but I'm gonna tell you what does it mean in a minute. The solution is, thanks to VoiSentry, allow them to have organizations such as hospital, clinics, primary care, physician, etc., that are the typical client of this company, to have their patients enrolling with their own voice. The system will initiate the outbound call to the IVR system. The patient uses an inbound IVR to identify himself using its voice, and the message system conveys the information to the right place. Again, here an array of benefits, such as no more passwords or pins, or security question to deal with, mom, dad, type of car, wine, beer, whatever you use. The enhancement of the patient's experience, much more secure messaging, the right information to the right patient, patient portal access, and HIPAA. And here we go. HIPAA stands for, are you ready? Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And it's something that President Clinton signed in 1996 in the United States. About that, this company also offers, and this is what I encourage you listeners to this webinar to do, a brand differentiator. So something that others do not offer to their own customers. Well, with this said, I will hand over to Mark that can talk about two very different case studies application that we had. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Walter. Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Bosworth here from Aculab, and I'd like to continue by talking about a couple more examples. The first one is in the financial services sector, and the client in this case is a leading retail bank based in continental Europe. It's a multinational business with branches in several countries and millions of customers throughout the region. Banking, as we all know, has changed dramatically over recent years. Gone are the days when customers would go into the branch in person, the staff might even know them, and they could verify themselves with a book, a checkbook, or a bank card, something of that nature. These days, banking is mostly carried out online or by telephone via a centralized contact center. In this case, verification is done using pins and passwords and by asking security questions or asking for some personal information. As we've heard, This presents a number of problems. Pins and passwords are not very convenient or necessarily very secure. People forget them. People use easy to guess passwords or reuse them across multiple platforms, making it easier for fraudsters to gain access to their accounts. The challenge for the client in this case was to provide a customer interface that was able to cope with the many thousands of verifications per day required in multiple languages, in different dialects, and to maintain a good service to its customers while at the same time improving security. Entering into a discussion with Aculab's partner MyForce. MyForce is a specialist in the field of contact center solutions and speech technologies. The bank decided to investigate biometric forms of authentication, and voice in particular, which is ideally suited to being used remotely over the telephone. It was decided to incorporate voice as part of a multi-factor approach for enhanced security, and also to use a fixed passphrase for enrollment and for verification. VoiSentry can be used with either a fixed passphrase or with conversational speech, and MyForce developed the front-end IVR system, integrated VoiSentry, which is installed in a virtual machine in a secure data center environment within the bank's environment. The benefits in this case were fairly normal, and Matt has already talked about some of the benefits that can be accrued. An increasingly frictionless ID and V process, but improving security, therefore helping to prevent fraud, and providing a good customer experience. The second example I'd like to talk about is somewhat different. In fact, in the prisons and correctional institutions sector. Our client in this case is a provider of technology and telephony solutions into that sector, and they provide services to inmates and to their families. In this specific case, we're talking about jails, where people are detained and kept in temporary custody on a short-term basis. This results in a very transient population with a constant turnover of people, and during that period, the inmates somehow need to authenticate themselves to gain access to use of the telephone and to other shopping privileges. Currently, this is done with pins and passwords, unfortunately resulting in a very high level of fraud. Again, fairly obviously, pins and passwords can be fairly easily shared or stolen or coerced out of another person. And with an average daily population into the tens of thousands and each inmate making multiple calls, the system needed to be designed to cope with a very high volume of demand and a high volume of verifications, attempted verifications each day. On top of that, the system is taxpayer funded, so usage needs to be somehow checked or monitored so that the authorities can ensure that the system isn't being defrauded and that the service provider can be reimbursed accurately. In this case, again, voice biometric was identified as a suitable solution, and Aculab's VoiSentry was scoped out as a multi-node cluster to provide the high capacity required, as well as adding resilience and redundancy across multiple instances. When people are brought into the jail, they're given the opportunity to enroll their voice into the system so that it can be used for future verification and to gain access to their privileges. A number of benefits resulted from this implementation, including reduction of fraud attempts, improved security for the inmates' accounts, and a reduction in lost revenue for the telephony services provider, thus resulting in better value for the taxpayer and for the government. An added benefit that can also be designed into the solution is that the system can be designed to periodically check that it's still the same authenticated caller on the call throughout. At this stage, I'll hand back to Matt, who's going to continue with the presentation.
Thank Thanks, Mark and Walter, for some fantastic examples of how to deploy voice biometrics in situations, including consumer-facing, but in a far broader range of applications where voice biometrics can be of use. When looking at adoption, then both for end users, employees, consumers, and other user types, as we've just looked at, probably the most important concept I think it's worth understanding is what I call the voice biometrics value chain, as shown here. Now, we use a far more detailed version in our consulting engagement. For the purpose of this conversation, I've simplified it. I just want to highlight 3 key points. One, unlike most services you could just switch on, voice biometric systems tend to take more time to deliver a change experience because we need one or more interactions in which we are confident of the speaker's identity to enroll them and gain their consent before the next interaction when we can use the new factor for verification. In fact, in most cases, it will increase the cost of the service to give you to get the time or to have the right conversations at the front of this process before you start getting benefits at the back end of it. As we need to be confident we know who we enrolled, not every call is an opportunity for enrollment, and not every call by an enrolled customer is a candidate for verification, as they don't always identify themselves correctly. It's important to note that we do need to have that claimed identity to check against. And in most cases, except possibly security, we only start to derive benefit when we get a different outcome than would have happened with a legacy method. Either we get it quicker, or we get a match when we previously have failed, or when an imposter is denied access. So enrolling and verifying customers who were previously using other tokens is unlikely to deliver quick benefits. So when thinking about implementation, it's important to think about how to maximize enrollments or registrations, as they're sometimes called, of the right speaker, which leads to 4 important considerations. The first, and very topical at the moment, but by their nature, biometric factors are considered deeply personal by many, and have attracted varying degrees of attention from legislators and regulators, resulting in a reasonably complex legal environment depending on where you operate. Whilst many will be scared by the 4 letters of GDPR, it has actually greatly clarified organizations' responsibilities here, and in practice codified what we've always found to be best practice anyway. But you do need to be clear about your strategy and the level of consent you need in order to create these voice prints. Second, given that the best practice has always been to ask for some form of permission from the end user, and that GDPR now requires this to be explicit in many markets, I guess other than the prison use case, how you design this experience is critical to the level of uptake and value delivered by any service. Third, as this will inevitably involve frontline users, it's important to start building advocacy and engagement with these users early. And finally, when thinking about sequencing, identifying the customer groups or lines of business that are likely to deliver the most value quickest is as important as getting some large numbers of registered customers through the service. Finally, over to Ian to have a more in-depth discussion about the return on investment and how you can try out these services yourself.
Okay, thank you very much to Matt for those insights. The heading here includes the phrase lower costs. Well, look, it's like the old adage, you have to speculate to accumulate. Whichever method you employ to encourage your customers to purchase your solutions, one thing you do is to persuade them that spending money in the short term gets them fiscal and such like benefits over the long term. It's the same with any investment in technology, and it's no different with voice biometrics. Your customers give you the money, and you give them the benefits. That's the deal. A key thing to note with voice biometrics is that it can be justified on a range of benefits, as you will have already gathered. So it's not just financial benefits like lower costs. Nevertheless, that's part of the equation. If you're selling contact center solutions, your customers are going to be interested in key performance indicators. Those could be call center metrics like call waiting time, time to answer, average talk time, and the time for manual agent-led ID&V, as well as first call resolution and the cost per call or the cost per transaction. So I'm sure you'll recognize most of those. All of those and more can be positively impacted by implementing voice biometrics, either directly or indirectly. All those metrics have a relationship to the bottom line. Otherwise, why measure them? If you offer an automated authentication feature in your solutions, you will be able to illustrate the benefits versus manual authentication. It's the same for many market sectors, such as you've heard in relation to the case study examples, but it's particularly relevant in the contact center. Manual authentication takes time, anywhere from half a minute, which admittedly isn't much, but it adds up over weeks and months in any size of a contact center, to 3 minutes or more per call. So automation makes sense because it reduces the time to a fraction and, into the bargain, frees up the agent, who can be more engaged, increasingly motivated, and more productive. A high percentage of callers are authenticated via agents or advisors, a process that is neither quick nor simple. That means the opportunity for cost saving by diverting to an automated self-service option is significant. Furthermore, as the most important factor for the majority of customers, over 90% of them, is resolution of their issue, by offering frictionless self-service authentication through voice biometrics, your customers' end users will find their customer experience enhanced. So, integrated authentication solutions can improve performance. Your customers will get better productivity, they will see a more cost-effective use of time, whether it's dealing with customers over the phone or managing staff and resources, and they will see a reduction in time spent on unproductive activities, all of which equates to lower costs as measured for those activities. So, okay, let's talk a wee bit about ROI. If the organization saves costs and becomes more productive and cost effective, that improves the bottom line and provides an ROI into the bargain. If you enable customers to reduce the time spent on calls, they are able to reduce the cost of handling those calls. If you show them how to add up that reduction and annualize it based on measures like time saved per call, cost per call, the number of calls, the number of call handlers, etc., you will be able to demonstrate a year-on-year ROI, purely and simply on the basis of cost saving. If that saving year-on-year is less than the annualized cost of deploying voice biometrics in your solution, you can demonstrate an ROI to your customers. But there's more to consider on the financial benefits side of things. If your customers factor in the savings from having less cases of fraud to deal with, i.e. less is lost to fraudsters, the ROI calculation becomes a no-brainer. Moreover, just get your customers to think about the savings from not having to pursue fraudsters through a legal process, and, if there are less cases of fraud to investigate, the savings from not having to pay out in compensation or reimbursement. Factor those into your ROI examples, and for sure it's a no-brainer. To be fair, all of that is true if the cost to you, i.e. the price you pay for voice biometrics, enables you to sell at a price that not only gives your customers the kind of ROI I've been talking about, but means you are able to make a margin in doing so. If your customers are large global corporate enterprises who are mitigating fraud can save them millions per year, they might be happy to fork out $1 million or so for voice biometrics. However, your average SME isn't in that ballpark, either in terms of likely losses or in relation to potential savings. VoiSentry isn't in this ballpark either. VoiSentry is priced to ensure you have ample opportunity to make a margin when integrating it into your enterprise solutions. If you want to discuss ROI examples for a particular scenario, contact us and we'll be happy to engage with you. So look, we indicated you get an opportunity to have access to our VoiSentry test environment. That's effectively a sandbox facility where you can exercise the VoiSentry APIs and develop a demo or proof of concept from the comfort of your own lab. The remote sandbox environment means you can create an application or an integration without having to install any software on your side. It also means that you don't have to license any software. If you're interested in accessing the sandbox, please let us know by sending an email to sales@aculab.com or by contacting your Aculab account manager. You'll need to sign up to an NDA, and your free access period will, naturally, be time-bound. However, we'll provide you with the necessary documentation, API guides and the like, and a package of training material designed to get you up and running in a short space of time. So that's the webinar concluded, and we're going to turn now to the questions. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in the control panel. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions come in already. Perhaps Mark could answer this question about, well, in fact, I'll just answer it myself. There's no point in engaging anybody else. The question is, how is it licensed? So VoiSentry is licensed on an annual subscription. and there are a number of options within that, basic strategy, if you like. And if you need to know more detail, of course, please engage with us as otherwise identified. Looking at the questions now, there's a couple here that would be ideal for Matt. So if I read out the questions, perhaps we can patch in Matt to provide the answers. So the first one is something I've seen myself in the news recently. There was an article about the Information Commissioner's Office with a judgment against the HMRC here in the UK. So, Matt, should we be concerned about the regulators' attitude to those types of services?
I think that's a really great question. There were some very specific issues with the case that the ICO found against HMRC. I think most specifically, the HMRC clearly has a lot more power and influence than many organizations and has a almost universal right to investigate things. So there was considered by the regulators to be some imbalance of power in the way in which consent was obtained. And there were some other challenges with the way in which the consent process was designed. I don't think those represent kind of best practice as a commercial or consumer or even business-to-business facing organization would seek to deploy this technology. And the ICO themselves have issued some really clear guidelines as to what constitutes fair and transparent consent and when it needs to be obtained. Interestingly, even at the kind of having passed this enforcement action, their own blog and their own kind of, I think it was the Deputy Information Commissioner's blog article specifically said that they do not seek to stop innovation in this kind of space, but that they will be kind of they will kind of look out for the interests of the individual, but that their intention is not to stop innovation in this area. And I think they're working on some more detailed guidance as well. But I actually think GDPR has kind of improved the situation, and it kind of gives you a rule book you can go to and get some direction as opposed to before when you had to kind of interpret and infer things. So I don't think most organizations should be worried about that or worried about the way in which it might impact adoption or usage of these technologies.
Okay, Matt, thanks for that. So perhaps I could throw this next question back at you as well then. So we've been asked about typical adoption rates for these type of applications by end consumers.
So I think that there are clearly a number of different use cases that you've looked at today. So there's the employee use case or an internal service use case. And adoption rates in those services tend to be very, very high. You need to look at kind of making sure that you're not kind of forcing people to hand over their biometric data. But when they increase user convenience, they can be very high. You've got kind of more mandatory use cases like the prison, which I think they would probably, if you want to make a phone call, you have to use this service, and to a certain extent, some of your rights are suspended in that environment. So there, I'd expect pretty high adoption. And in consumer-facing applications, probably the two kind of principal things to consider are to the extent to which the process is automated and additional to the conversation that's otherwise taking place versus just part of that process. So we tend to see two different ways of using the technology. One, the kind of text-dependent way. I think we talked about that in one of the use case examples where you have a static passphrase. Those passphrases need to be repeated a couple of times, and invariably they need to be spoken to a computer system. So and are kind of more automated and mechanistic. We do see lower levels of adoption of those technologies, slightly lower levels of adoption of those technologies because they, depending on how you implement them. But I think it's all about the design in that case. When we're looking at how we deploy maybe in parallel with an agent-based conversation, adoption in that situation tends to be incredibly high because there's no additional effort the customer needs to go through. It's a bit of a no-brainer. We see upwards of 80% acceptance rates, if not even up into the high 95 and plus acceptance rates when the process is designed well and the users who are promoting the service are advocates of it. Does that help?
Okay, so that's great, Mark. Thanks very much for both of those answers. In fact, it's excellent. We've had a few more questions come in, so I'll just deal with a couple of those now. Been asked if the system is text dependent or text independent. So the essential answer to that is it could be used in either mode or method, whichever word you like to use for that. But it could also be used for text prompted in a text prompted mode. So it's pretty flexible in that context. Another sort of similar question, if you like, we've been asked if it works in all languages. Well, it's offered as language independent. So yes, of course, in theory, but I'm sure one or two of you could identify languages that we haven't tested with, and that's fair enough. But we know it works in a range of languages in practice. English and variations of English like Australian and American and so on, and South American languages like Spanish and Portuguese, and Eastern European languages like Czech and Slovakian and what have you. So it's designed to be language independent, and in terms of what we've come across so far, that's proven to be true or correct. Another question is whether it's active or passive solutions. So again, it could be used in either. So passive is sort of synonymous with text independent. So yes, it could be used in that modality. And active is usually where you're using a passphrase. There are sort of household examples of what a passphrase might be. But key thing with VoiSentry is that you can have what we call an autonomous passphrase. So each individual user in theory could have their own passphrase, or each business unit or each business customer could have their own passphrase. You can use it in that way. By the same questioner, we've been asked if it's on premises or cloud or both. So what we're offering is essentially a VM-based solution that could be installed on premises in conjunction with, let's say, for example, a contact center solution, or thinking about the use case example that Walter presented with ITEL. They've integrated the VoiSentry VM with their end user solution, which is like a remote hosted, managed services solution to that IPO customer in northern Italy. So it could be used in a hosted data center environment to provide a managed service, or integrated on premises with an end user solution of some description. There's another interesting question here about can you provide a single voice print for both active and passive? So yes, in theory you could do that, but I would suggest that it's not the best thing to do. The way that we handle like active solutions, for example, based on the passphrase, whatever that passphrase is, part of the analysis we do is identify that the correct passphrase is being spoken. So if you have a voice print that's tuned for that passphrase, then it's going to be less ideal for conversational speech, or sort of passive speech, if you like, and vice versa. So there you go. That's an answer to that question. There's a couple of questions just to wrap up on the sandbox that I mentioned. So it's possible to try VoiSentry via the sandbox, and the question is essentially how long would the sandbox remain active or available? So I think what's meant there is how long would we provide you access to the sandbox, and in some ways that depends on the commercial opportunity and the discussion between us. But I mentioned that it's time bound, and typically we would time bound it for 60 or 90 days initially. That should give you ample time to to test it out or develop a proof of concept or whatever. So that's the sandbox, and I think that I'll just wrap up on there then. The questions have sort of dried up, and we've had our allocated 45 minutes just over. So if we move on, then I'd just like to leave you with some final thoughts as closing marks, essentially. So the message then for developers and OEM partners is that VoiSentry will help you present a number of benefits to your customers. So not only will it help them mitigate fraud and security risks, it'll provide a significant improvement on the customer experience. And perhaps that's the most important thing in the age of omni-channel contact center operations. You can offer your customers speed and convenience, as Matt was saying, for your clients and end users, and you can remove the frustration of agent-led ID&V. And you can also offer an improvement in many performance indicators, all of which means that your customers see cost savings and get a rapid ROI. So thank you very much to all of our presenters, particularly Matt Smallman, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Please note that once you leave the webinar, you'll get a follow-up email within a day or so with a link to view the recording. So once again, on behalf of Aculab and our presenters, thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.